Hola a todos, bienvenidos, welcome everybody. My name is Jasmine Fuego, and I'm so excited to be here with you for this session for the LTX Quest 2021. It has been such an interesting year, but it is incredible that we can all be here in the virtual world to celebrate our community and the work that we've been doing. So in this session, we are going to be discussing how Latinidad, how us as Latinos can better serve our Afro-Latinx community. These conversations are deeply personal and so important and touch us all in different ways. We're going to be diving deep into the benefits and the limitations of Afro-Latinidad and addressing anti-Blackness within our community, something that we may all have connection to, or maybe are just becoming aware of, how it harms our efforts in racial equality, and how we can broaden our community and broaden our understanding of ourselves by embracing the Afro-Latinos in our community. We're going to learn how we can better show up for the Afro-Latinx and Indigenous members of our community, and of course, be hearing from multiple perspectives on what we can do to build better coalition within our community as a whole. So I'm so grateful and honored to be joined here by our panelists who are going to introduce themselves in just a moment. But just to start it off, my name again is Jasmine Fuego. I use she, her pronouns. I am a creative and a program manager by day at Skillshare, living bi-coastally between Los Angeles and New York. I am going to bring it over to our panelists and jump right into our first discussion point. So hello, my beautiful panelists. It's so good to see you and spend this time with you. Let's jump right in. I want to know, can you tell me a little bit about your superhero origin story? Obviously, you all have insane LinkedIn bullet points of all the things that you've done and achieved, but I would love to know about what has brought you here to this conversation today. What are some defining moments in your life that propelled your path forward? And yeah, how did you arrive to where you are today? So I'm going to just bring this question to some of you all specifically. Ladies first. So Arianna, would you like to start?
Sure. I had a feeling you were going to pick on me first.
Claro que sí.
No worries. Origin story. Wow. I mean, I think my story, when I think about it, starts probably when I was literally 8 years old, and I wrote a book for my mom about a monster and a skeleton who were two best friends. And I knew back then that I wanted to be a writer. That was like my kind of, I'm one of those people who's lucky that they knew for a very long time what they wanted to do. I've always been very passionate about written word and storytelling. And so I've known for a long time I wanted to be a writer. I went to Penn State University, and it was there that I kind of really fell into my love of magazines. But, you know, working at a magazine at that time, there weren't really a lot of people who looked like us. And I really started out I got an internship at a newspaper right after I graduated as the New York Daily News, which was an amazing opportunity. And I started there. And then not long after that, I basically, through stalking an alumni at Penn State who had spoken at a scholarship dinner that I went to, she luckily was nice and had coffee with me, and she really helped me kind of get my foot in the door in the world of magazines. And that was how I got my start at Oprah magazine. So I started my career there as an intern, and eventually I was Gail King's assistant, and I was a writer and editor at Oprah. And then I left and I worked at Us Weekly, also Refinery 29. And then I came back to Oprah in 2018 to launch the website. So kind of a full circle moment. And that's like the origin story in like super, super fast forward speed. But yeah, I've always loved writing and storytelling, and I've always been a hustler, and I've always really wanted to just be in this industry and be someone who can also open the door for more people who look like me. And I guess the other thing I'll mention is that I published my first book last fall in October. It's called What Would Frida Do? A Guide to Living Boldly, inspired by the artist Frida Kahlo. So always been a wordsmith, word lover, and that's a little bit about me. And I guess next I'll throw it to Jonathan.
Oh, before we throw it to Jonathan, and I'm so silly for not mentioning this, all of us are invited here, obviously, because we identify as Latinx, Latine, Latino, Latina. Would love to hear where in the large branch of Latinidad your family fits. So I'm Afro-Nicaragüense, first generation here in the U.S., and would love to hear from you, Arianna, before we pass it off to Jonathan, where your people come from.
Sure, yeah. So my mom is Boricua, she's Puerto Rican, and my dad is actually African American. So it's interesting because even just thinking about being Afro-Latina, it's kind of something that I've wondered about, because my mom is, you know, Puerto Rican, but like very white presenting Puerto Rican, right? She's like blonde, fair skin. And then my dad is Black, meaning like African American Black. So I grew up considering myself biracial, because I basically had to, most people, they think I'm white, or if they know she's Latina, and then my dad is African American. So identity is something that I've always thought a lot about, and even just the idea of being Afro-Latina and Afro-Latinidad, it's definitely something that is interesting, because for me, I'm like, am I Afro-Latina if I have one parent who's African American and one parent who is white presenting Latina, right? So that's kind of where I fall and where my background is.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd love to pass that chain of questions over to you, Jonathan. And just to recap, the question is, if you could share with us some of your origin story and how you arrived here today, and of course, where your people come from and where you fit into the historia de Latinidad.
Thank you so much for the questions and for the invitation to be a part of this panel. My name is Jonathan J. Green. My pronouns are they and them. And I'm currently the Vice President of Programs of the Marguerite Casey Foundation. We are a national philanthropic organization that funds and supports local community organizers across the country. But when I think about my origin story, I go back to 2005, December 19th, 2005, which is where my family and I moved from Panama to the United States. And I think particularly around the stories that I was told and I believed about who we as a country were, right? I think about the concept of the American dream. I think about, like land of opportunity, land of the free, all of these different mantras that as a young kid were really impressionable to me. And I was like, oh my goodness, what an incredible honor to be a part of this country. And as I got older, when you think about sort of how I got here, I oftentimes think about my work through two different lenses. I think one, I'm someone who deeply believes that freedom and justice is possible. And I've dedicated my career to fighting for it wherever I've been. So whether it's been on the organizing side, when I got to co-found and launch Black, which is a national organization that organizes Black immigrants at the intersection of racial justice, immigration, and criminal justice. Whether it's my work in government, working both at the state level in Maryland, and then working in a presidential campaign last year for Senator Elizabeth Warren, and whether it's now in philanthropy, trying to figure out how do we organize resources to actually build power and shift who holds power in this country. I feel like the theme has been like the fight for justice and freedom. And on a personal level, I really feel like being a 13-year-old kid back in 2005 and, sort of being shaken by the promise and the rhetoric of this country, and realizing that for a lot of people that I cared about, including myself and my family, a lot of those stories were not true, right? I oftentimes think about it as political heartbreak and what it means for people like me to not give up on who this country can be. But instead to love it in a way that Baldwin will talk about. You love this country so much that you have to criticize them and do the work to make sure that she is better for all of our people. I'm going to pass it over to Joshua.
On mute, I was just like, period. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Joshua, the same questions for you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Jonathan and Arianna. Joshua Encarnacion. I'm Dominican, Venezuelan. My dad is from Nagua. He, immigrated to the US in the 80s in New York, where he actually met my mother. My mother's from Queens, New York. Her mother's from Santiago, I believe. And really, my origin story kicks off with just being born to the two of them in the time that I was born in. I had a mother that could be as close to resembling Maya Angelou's Still I Rise spirit as possible, right? And because I was raised by that powerful woman, I'm able to continue to push through challenges in the world that are available to all of us as, Latinos, Latinas, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinas, Latinx people, right? And folks that come from our communities, our heritage, our nationality, however you want to look through whatever lens to describe who we are. And a father that was a hustler in every sense of the word, but was deported early on in my life, which pushed me and my mother to think through how to work through tough challenges for our family that was present and for the family that was to come. Having had those experiences so early on with what Jonathan was pointing to in terms of, systemic oppression and the inequalities that face families like ours at all times, you start to build up that tough skin way before you know you even need it. And so that informed a lot of my work in subconscious ways, and that work being thinking about leadership and leadership development and the capacity of building teams, recruiting, training, hiring, talent management, talent development. What does it mean to put people together in a room and have them solve a problem, build an organization, build a business? Think about the role of an executive, thinking about the role of a startup founder, thinking about the roles that people play at organizations that are supposed to emulate, that success and that freedom, that justice that we look for as a result of problem solving. So, you get put in a tough situation. Folks like us, we're not back against the wall for too long, but you start to analyze that and you see the stories that we use to push us through those tough times. I think I'm still stuck on what is that science, what is that art that us and our people continue to make use of to do better, whether that mean economically, whether that's just in the way that we treat each other, whether that's for ourselves personally or professionally. I don't really discriminate in that way. I think as long as you can aspire to be a better person, you'll make it happen. I seen that firsthand with my Dominican parents that, were introduced to a nation that didn't really understand what to do with Dominican people. And I can say that time and again on any platform. So I'm excited for this conversation, and hopefully that paints the picture for what brought me here today.
Wow, it absolutely does. It's so beautiful to hear our stories. And for me personally, with the exception of the time that I get to spend in New York, I'm so rarely around Afro-Latine, Latinx, Afro-Latino people. It's so beautiful because all of our stories are so unique, but I'm seeing for sure, I'm feeling some very consistent through lines with some of our stories. And it brings me to my next question, which I think is actually a part of a larger conversation that's happening in the Latino, Latinx community around that identity as Latinx, which I know that the term Latinx in this moment is, it in and of itself is quite controversial because it doesn't actually translate well into Spanish. It's spelled Latinx. You can't really, there's no way to say that. I've recently switched over to Latine, but for the purpose of this conversation, there's a lot of conversation around the term Latinx, Latino, that some people believe that it should be eliminated because while there is a through line that connects people of Latin origin, there's an argument that being Latinx, Latine is not a one size fits all term and should be withheld for very specific uses. And I'm really, and for me personally, similar to you, Arianna, my my Latin parent, my father is Nicaragua. He's from Nicaragua, white presenting, and my mother is Black American. And so even being able to identify myself as an Afro-Latinx person is relatively new. And I still grapple with, do I have the right to claim that as, someone with just one white presenting Latin parent? So I'm just so curious with that term, Latinx, Latine, Latino. What are y'all's personal perspectives on the debate of if we should be using that term as kind of an umbrella catch-all for all people, basically all people from Latin America? Would love to hear your thoughts on like pros and cons of that. And just to switch up the order, Jonathan, can I kick it off to you first?
Sure, yeah. I want to take this from a couple of different perspectives. I think there's something that is happening and has been happening for some time with the backlash to the word Latinx in the United States. I just want to tell the truth. Like, it oftentimes feels like, like the arguments that I've heard against it has been like, actually did a hit on MSNBC a couple of weeks ago with former Representative Carlos Curbelo, and his whole argument was that, it was being imposed on Latinx communities by the elite. And I want to just like ground us on like the reason why, right? Like our communities more broadly. So it's like Latinx or Latine, which has been very well used throughout Latin America as well. Like the reason why we are pushing for a gender inclusive term isn't just to like sound woke and sound cool, or it isn't being pushed by MSNBC. But it's because activists and scholars from our communities, have chosen to interrupt the patriarchy in this colonial language that we have, to make space for those of us who are non-binary, for those of us who are trans as part of our community. So I want to make sure that the record is clear that the reason why these conversations are happening should be rooted on those who are most vulnerable, who who may be in Latin America, who are maybe crossing on their way to the US fleeing persecution. So I want to make sure that it is grounded on like the who. And so that's like the first layer. The second layer, I think, to the criticism from maybe the left around whether or not Latinx or Latinidad more broadly is an adequate term to describe our people. And I think it's a very fair criticism, right? Like, I know that for me, I can both be very proud of like my community being from Latin America, our culture, our customs, and I'm really clear that where most of that comes from is from Black people, right? Like when I think about our food, when I think about our dances, right? Like to me, when I celebrate being Panamanian, I'm actually celebrating Blackness, right? So I'm less interested in reforming a concept that did not have me in mind to begin with, but I'm much more interested in making sure that people who are currently a part of our community renew, and deepen their commitment to fighting anti-Blackness both at home and abroad. Like that's actually what's most important to me, because what I keep seeing is that we get caught up in the semantics, but we are not having a conversation about the material conditions of Black people, both in the United States and throughout Latin America. And that's the conversation that I think is most important. And like, if people who are against Latinx, Latine, whatever, still want to fight for Black lives in the US and in Latin America, cool. That's fine with me, but that's usually not what I found. I'm gonna kick it over to Joshua.
I'm going to keep my remarks short because I agree with a lot of what Jonathan has shared. I mean, I think the broader question or the depth of your question really comes down to, are you okay with fighting against misogyny and toxic masculinity and just like patriarchal norms within our communities and our heritage, our nationality, our roots? And additionally, are you okay with fighting against anti-Blackness? If that's so, then I'll allow language to be fluid. But if it's not, then language is powerful and the words that you choose matter. So just be mindful of both. But I'll stay right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely have to agree that I think I feel like so much of the conversation is getting lost in semantics, and it's like, you know, with it being about to use Latinx or not, is like there's so much that gets lost in that argument. I will say, I think that personally, I feel that identity and labels can be personal. So I think that, like, usually I feel that if someone tells me they prefer not to be called Latinx or they prefer Latina over Latinx, like, I think that identity is about what you personally want to be called. And so I feel that it can be tricky for me, especially as a journalist, because a lot of times writing articles or like writing, you know, creating content, you are thinking about the entire community at large, and not everybody wants to have one label or another label applied to them. So it definitely can be tricky, and it's something that we're always talking about in our newsroom. But I think when it comes to me on a personal level, you know, I've adopted Latinx, but I also now with Latina, I see that it can be confusing and it can be, you know, always evolving. And when I'm talking to my 92-year-old abuela, she's like, Latinx? Like, she's like, she's not using Latinx. So it is, I think, a very layered conversation. And I think that but that is really more about language. And I think the bigger issue is what we're talking about today, which is, I think the more pressing issue is about how we can make sure that the Latinx or Latina or Latino, whatever we are calling it, communities are doing better by their people and are as inclusive as possible, whether that means non-binary and trans or whether it means Black people. I think that is really what is more at the root of it versus, like, you know, how woke are you by what label or word you're using. I think that that's where we get so lost, and so much of the, like, kind of Twitter arguments and back and forth is forgetting the bigger questions and the bigger, more pressing, urgent needs here.
Yeah. Can I add one last thing, Jasmine? Yeah, I just really agree with what both Joshua and Arianna shared. And I think the question that I ask folks who are very interested in getting caught up in the semantics and that dialogue without talking about the material conditions of our people is, who is your allegiance to? Is your allegiance to a colonial language that was imposed on us? Or is your allegiance to the people who are marginalized, who are part of our community, who are literally dying in the streets because they're erased as part of the narrative, because of structural oppression, because of anti-Blackness? So I think that's like a quick question that I want to leave for folks to ponder on, and I'm going to take it back to you.
Hold on real quick. Arianna, I really, really think you did something when you said Latinx. Like, we can't let that
really
pass,
did.
because I've heard that from so many, like, parents and grandparents, and like,
yeah, that's a whole other element, and it is really hard when you think specifically about language, because yes, it's a colonial language, but it still is the language that, like, our grandparents and their grandparents spoke, and it is a language that's based on gender. And so it's like, when you're talking to somebody who, like, doesn't even understand, my grandmother's not on Facebook, so she barely even understands social media. She's still, you know, and I come from a family, my mom's side of the family, the Puerto Rican side, didn't speak to my mom for many years because she married my dad, who's Black. So, like, that's a whole other layer where, so, like, we're talking about, like, I'm 34 years old. So, like, 34 years ago in my family, like, you know, someone marrying a Black man was still enough to, like, not speak to them. So to me, it's like the conversation around, like, Latinx, Latina, whatever, it's like so much more, like, it's like that's so much more insignificant versus, like, the deeper issues of, like, okay, so, like, there are still things that we shouldn't say about Black people when we're around each other. You know, like, I think that it's like, yes, that is important, but there are a lot of deeper things. And so for me, I'm like, I just need to make sure my grandmother is, like, understanding that, like, you know, being more inclusive and seeing the world differently. And, like, if she may never get around to understanding Latinx, and I think that's okay.
And asking that question that Jonathan asked us.
Yes, exactly.
I think that these are all such important points. I mean, I think in general, a lot of what's happening in the cultural conversation and the zeitgeist in the U.S., and I want to be very specific that we're speaking about a very United States centric concept. as I've led many conversations with people from throughout Latin America, many of them are often not even identifying as Latina, Latino, Latinx. So it is interesting to hear the semantics of it, because I think in the US, there has been a need, I think, for a lot of our ancestors who came here however many generations ago, and even for ourselves to find coalition with people who may have experienced the same things with immigration stories, and also with like cultural and racial identities. And I think but I do feel that, especially when we're trying to build coalitions cross-generationally, is that a word, Arianna? Okay, all right, cool. Check me on my grammar, girl. You know, you making up things. That's word to me. Okay, it's a word though. But we're trying to really build coalitions, not just across the spectrum of our own generation, but we want to, make sure that our parents understand the concepts and not get held up by. And I love what you said, Joshua. Like, listen, as long as you're showing up for the thing, I don't really care what words you use. And I think that kind of mentality can be helpful when it comes to building coalitions and really showing up for the members in our community, because so much of language is privilege. I think access to understanding certain terms, I think comes with a lot of, I imagine many of us are quite well read and stay up with the news and the happenings and the things, and not everyone has equal access or even time or capacity to do that. And making sure to stay open for that. And I'm curious. Yes.
Can I add one quick thing?
Add a quick thing.
Okay, great. I love this. The one piece that I wanted to make sure that I got across to folks who are viewing this panel is that though conversations about Latinidad and Latinx are US centric, like there is also, I want to make sure that we're not invisibilizing like social movements throughout Latin America who are working to make sure that they're using more gender neutral language, right? So it might not be Latinx, but I know that a couple of weeks ago, Argentina just added an X to their state ID to be able to like acknowledge non-binary folks on their country. So I want to make sure that part is also not erased, that like social movements exist and they are pushing across the board. And like, I want to make sure that they're seen as well.
Thank you so much for presencing that. Please go ahead.
No, just adding to that, like further validating, just like the conversation around Black Lives Matter happening in the Dominican Republic. Like there's a day that wouldn't even be within reach. Although like upwards of 60% of the DR is Black. And you could say the same for all the Caribbean and most all Latinx, Latine, Latin, Latino people.
I love that none of us have used the term Hispanic in here, because I'm for sure that is what my grandparents were. They still identify as Hispanic. And I'm like, what? Of all the terms we're throwing out, Hispanic is not one of them. Cool. Glad we're agreed on that. Well, that actually, Joshua, that was a beautiful segue into my next question, specifically focusing on Afro-Latinx people. What do you wish that people kept in mind as it relates to the Afro-Latinx experience? And specifically, when it comes to Latinidad as a whole, what do you think that people should keep in mind and what they should be thinking about when they're thinking about Black Latinx people as a part of our community? And I'll throw that to you, Joshua.
I think what is often missed, and I believe Arianna said this earlier, like labels are personal. Taking that further, I think it's just like we rob each other of our sense of agency in our lives because we're so quick to try to not just label each other, but also control each other in interesting ways. I mean, we know the impact that colorism has had on the world. And we see like colonialism impact as well. but we never think about how much we internalize those impacts and use those tools, those same tools, to survive amongst each other. And so, you know, to say that, like, if I was just on my block, right, like here in where I'm living, like, I'd want to say, like, don't try to control people, especially not using the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual orientation or their interests, like even down to that, because we have enough of that happening already in the world outside of our own folks. And that's a really hard conversation to have, even with your own parents or the guardians that you've had that raise you. I think it's tough. It's a tough one to have in general, because a lot of times we're just trying to stay close to each other. But I think the tools that we use to stay close to each other, they're not healthy. So when it comes down to, you know, Afro-Latinidad, Latinidad, Latinx, I think in general, it's just, how do we give people back a sense of control over who they are and how they define themselves and how they take responsibility for their life and the events that are happening in their lives? Because it's not easy for any one of us to try to show up the same as each other in whatever room. I mean, the four of us share something that's unique. We are aware of it, but let the four of us show up in a room and they try to figure out what like makes us the same. I'll laugh so loud to hear like what the responses are, especially from folks outside of our community. But even within, like being raised by a grandfather that calls me morenito, and then having that moment in life where I'm like being yelled at, like light skin, you know what's coming. I'm like, but abuelo me dice que yo soy morenito. And how do you have that moment? But like, even that moment being so small in comparison to the trajectory of somebody's lives changing because of that moment, and us not being aware of it. So I think to me, it really just comes down to, how do these conversations help people feel more in control of themselves and the way they have to respond to the events that show up in their world, and in our communities. But I think it's hard because we're trying to figure that out amongst ourselves with the world that doesn't, at least in my perspective and in my opinion, doesn't want us to figure it out. But maybe that opinion will change. I hope what y'all share will help me change it.
Go ahead, Arianna. I see you took yourself off mute, girl. I was about to pass it to you anyway. Thank you, Joshua.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what Joshua said. I think that we just need to have more grace for each other in these conversations, right? Like, I think it's like, especially, unfortunately, I think there's pros and cons to social media. I think one of the pros is that I do see a lot more people in our community having this conversation on social media, which I think is a beautiful thing. But I also think that it can make it very black and white. And I think that there are so many layers. Like, you know, I feel, you know, I to an extent understand when Dominicans, for instance, are like, I am so proud to be Dominican that, you know, if I start calling myself Afro-Latino, I feel like I'm losing, you know, the fact that I'm Dominican and my pride in being Dominican. And it's like, I understand that. But on the other hand, it's like, you can be proud to be Dominican, but also like not anti-Black. And like, there is a way to do both and to embrace both. And I also understand that, like I said earlier, it is really personal, but also, unfortunately, there are labels that automatically just get applied to us when we walk in a room, right? Like, you know, I think all of us here, if we walked into a room, most people would just assume, oh, they're Black. And they wouldn't even like, and then especially to somebody who's not in tune with the Latinx community, they're like, wait, so you're Puerto Rican? Wait, hold on. And it's like, that's a whole other conversation that you got to have. So I think that as far as thinking of the question, what I think people would consider or think about, I just think that it's just the fact that it is really so layered, and this is just only a new conversation. I think when I was researching at one point, I think the term Afro-Latina or Afro-Latino only really started bubbling up like less than 12, 15 years ago. So it's like, we're going from people still training people to not say Hispanic to like Latinx to now Afro-Latinx to Afro-Latinidad. It's like, it's always going to be a journey. And like probably 10 years from now, like if I have kids, there'll be something else, you know? So it's, I think it's really complicated when it's like, you know, how I identify versus how people identify me. And like when you try to figure out what the middle is in between there, I think that we just need to have a little bit more grace. And if somebody doesn't want to embrace the term Afro-Latinx just yet, like that's okay. Like that's on them. But the question is, are you anti-Black and are you like supporting the Black community? Are you aware of the fact that you are a Black person? Are you doing what you can to make sure that our community is doing better by Black people? I think it kind of goes back to our earlier conversation of semantics. I think that can kind of get lost. So that's a long-winded answer, and I will throw it over to Jonathan now.
Jasmine, can you remind me the question one more time?
Yes. So the question, just going back to it, because now I was thinking about the next question. What do you wish that people kept in mind about the Afro-Latinx experience as a whole, as it relates to kind of Latinidad in this country, in the US?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think what I wish people really kept in mind is that there is no one Afro-Latinx experience, that there are a ton of different experiences depending where folks are from, which country, which traditions. Like, you know, like I feel like what oftentimes happens when like people discover that marginalized communities exist is that we want to like categorize everything about folks. That's usually not helpful, right? Like me being Panamanian is different from, you know, someone who's Boricua, someone who's Dominican, all, you know, in multiple ways. I want to make sure that people allow and are open to the beauty and the vastness of Blackness, right? And like the ways that it shows up. And again, like I think I said this earlier, and I've seen some of the themes throughout with what especially with Arianna just shared, like what I really want people to do is to act, to show up for Black people, right? To like, you know, if folks believe that I am a part of their community, then like help us fight for an immigration system that recognizes my existence and my worth, right? Like as someone who's still undocumented. If I'm a part of your community, if I'm your like sibling or whatever, help us defund the police department. You know, like if I'm a part of your community, then like help us end the ways in which trans and gender nonconforming folks are being oppressed both here in the US and across Latin America, right? Like I think that's what I keep coming back to, and like that is the work. Like it's, yes, it's personal, and also it's very much structural. And if folks are not willing to take structural action, then it's just never gonna change. And we're gonna be talking about this when I'm like 75, and I just don't want to do that. I just don't want to spend the rest of my life having this conversation.
Heard you.
Heard. Also was ending that with a period. I don't want to do that either. I don't want to do that. I want my kids to do that. I want my grandbabies to do that. I'm so tired of doing that and fighting for my existence and for the existence of the people in the community that I love and that I so deeply care about, to just be recognized, right? Like just to matter. Michael Che has this amazing piece in one of his stand-ups around like Black Lives Matter. Just like, really, y'all, it just matters. Not Black lives are more important, not Black lives need to, but just matters. We're really starting from the ground floor here, y'all. We matter. This kind of leads me to my next question. And ideally I could ask two more, but we'll just see, because if we end on this is what we end on, and that's okay. But this leads me into if Latinidad, and again, I want to ground this. I want to ground this in the U.S. Because I do think it's a specific experience that branches out, but also obviously speak to the cultural experience that may be happening around Latin America. If you have insight into that, but if Latinidad were to undergo a pro-Black transformation, what would that look like in your dream? And I mean, this can be as grounded and rooted, or as like, aspirational and imagination oriented as you are interpreting the question. What would it look like what would we as a community need to grapple with and repair? And what would we need to lean into in order to be able to do that as a community, as the Latinidad community? So I'm gonna actually throw that to you, Arianna, my writer, la escribidora.
This is the tough one. I mean, as you were talking, like the first thing that came to my mind was that, like, I hope that one day we don't even need to have the term Afro-Latinx, because like it's just like being Black is being Latino or Latinx or Latina. But at the same time, I also think that there is a pride in being Afro-Latina or Afro-Latinx, and I think that your experience, if you are a Black Latino, is maybe different than like the average Latinx person. But, you know, it's, so again, I think that's where it becomes a personal preference. It's like, if you want to keep using that term and that label for yourself, you should be able to. But I think that, I guess the vision for me is that like 10 years from now, this won't be a conversation. Like, it's just like, you know, Black people are Latinx and Latinx people are Black. And the reality is the majority of Latin people are actually Black. So I think it's kind of, I think a lot of it is cultural, unfortunately. A lot of it is like Joshua was saying in our families, like, you know, calling someone morenito or calling somebody negra or whatever, you know, the terms are. A lot of it is just like, I think it's going to take time and it's going to take generations. It's going to take, you know, this kind of like wokeness that like now our generation has. And like with our kids, we'll know that there are certain terms that used to be used that are actually derogatory, even though they used to be used in like affectionate ways. It's just like not okay to say those things. And I think a lot of it is just going to take time. And I think it's the same with just general racism in the United States. It's like, unfortunately, there are some people, I think, who come from a certain time and a certain point of view that aren't necessarily going to change. And we can try our best to educate them. But I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of hopefully like education through social media, and hopefully people are picking up the books that we keep seeing on the like educate yourself on race book lists and, you know, all those things. But it's going to take time. I think it's going to take time. And I hope that there comes a time where we're not having to have panels about, you know, how to better do the Afro-Latino community, because it's just like, it is what it is. But that's going to take a while.
If I can just piggyback to what Arianna said, absolutely. I like definitely don't want to be having these conversations anymore. And I also want the material conditions of Black people here in the US and across Latin America to be better. Like I want us to be able to look at the health outcomes of Black people and not see the massive inequity that I see today. I want us to be able to look at, socioeconomic status of Black people here and across the Americas and not see the disparities that we see today. I feel like once we get there, then we can have a conversation about reforming Latinidad or everything else.
To add to that list that Arianna was mentioning, Black behind the ears, really good. But I think if I was to try to imagine, like, without borders, like, I want to see Black, Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, Afro-Latinidad CEOs, executives be the majority, so that way we can drive, you know, empathy for the income inequality that then leads to the health issues that force us to do things like disrespect ourselves more tangibly, like the way that we don't listen to Black and brown women. It would be great if we do collectively. The way that we continue to trade off different forms of misogyny and homophobic behaviors, as a means of relating to each other. Like, if we can stop doing that, there's a lot of things. I mean, and then even like some of the smaller things, like if we can do away with pelo malo, then that'd be great, because everyone knows in our communities, like, pelo malo is huge. Why? Because we start to label each other around just the way that our hair is. But I think that that's twofold. Comes from the outside, comes from us. So the more we can do to show up and answer Jonathan's question, right? Like, keep our allegiance to being pro-Black, being pro-Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinidad, Afro-Latina, and just continue to show up for each other in actionable ways.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. So I would love to just take a moment to ground into everything and just take in everything that you all shared. I want to say thank you so much for sharing your personal stories, bringing a piece of your history, bringing pieces of your ancestors, and just bringing your stories full-heartedly to this conversation tonight. Some of you may have noticed Jonathan is a busy man doing important work and had to drop off for a moment. But with you all here, I wanted to take a moment to just take a deep breath in together and out, giving ourselves the time to really take home with us today, tonight, this afternoon, whatever time zone it is that you're in, everything that was shared. And if there's any one thing, that piece of advice that you could give to the rest of the Latino, Latinx, Latine, Latinx community, about how they can show up better, any recommendations for how they can show up better for the Afro-Latinx people in our community. If it's one word, 2 words, a sentence, would love to close us in that with some action that folks can take away from this conversation.
Well, I think anyone who's watching this conversation, first and foremost, that's a great start. The fact that you're even tuning in shows that you want to learn, that you're eager to learn. And I think otherwise, I would just say, I think education, I think reading, I think having conversations, I think empathy is the key to so much of how we become better as humans, is just understanding other people's experiences and really internalizing that and putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So I think the best way to do that is just by, obviously I'm biased, but I'd say read and just, educate yourself and keep doing more things like this.
To all my Latinx, in addition to what Arianna said, I would highly recommend being open to and critical of who you receive mentorship, coaching, therapy from. Obviously, learning from folks that are intentional about teaching and caring and trying to develop you as a person in whatever capacity you want to be developed. Make it happen. Reach out to people, ask tough questions.
I love this. And I'm just going to answer my own question. Listen to some Celia Cruz. Listen to some Celia Cruz, period. I want to thank you so much, Arianna. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you so much, Jonathan, everyone here at the LTX Quest. Thank you for joining us. And I hope that you all have a beautiful, beautiful rest of your day. Buenas. Ciao.